Steam billowed from the shower as Carl West reached for a towel, wiping the droplets from his face and hair. He exhaled deeply, looking at himself in the mirror. Green eyes reflected back his body, still sculpted from military discipline. After everything he had seen and done in the field, he thought he could handle anything. Until now, as he stepped out of the bathroom, water still clinging to his skin. He froze. Two figures, tall and otherworldly, stood at the door, their dark blue skin glistening under the bathroom light. Their sleek bodies draped in silver garments shimmered with an ethereal glow. Their black, expressionless eyes stared at him unblinking. Carl's mind scrambled for explanations. Was this some sort of bizarre dream? A prank? He laughed uneasily, wiping his face, but his body stiffened when one of the aliens stepped forward, its arm extended toward him. Without warning, its cold fingers brushed against his arm, and a sharp sting shot through his body as something metallic pressed into his skin. He barely had time to process the sudden pain before a warm liquid began to course through his veins, burning and numbing him all at once. What? What on earth? Carl stammered, stumbling back before he could react. Darkness swallowed him whole. When Carl awoke, he was no longer in his bathroom. Slowly, he sat up, blinking as his vision adjusted. The sight before him was nothing short of stunning. He was in a grand hall, the architecture unlike anything he had ever seen. It was a palace, but not of earthly design. Everything felt too unreal, yet his gut told him it was all very real. At the far end of the hall, seated upon an opulent throne, was a figure draped in black and silver. Her posture was regal, her dark blue skin contrasting with the red glow of the chamber's lights. Her hair, black as midnight, flowed in waves down her back, and her piercing black eyes were locked onto him, the alien queen. Carl West, her voice boomed through the hall, sharp and commanding. You have been brought here for a purpose. Carl's muscles tensed, instinctively scanning his surroundings for an escape. You were chosen, she continued, her tone brooking no argument. You possess what we need. You will not refuse. Chosen. Carl finally found his voice, though it was rough with disbelief. For what? The queen's eyes narrowed, and with a flick of her wrist she summoned a figure from the shadows. Emerging from behind a massive pillar was another alien, younger and strikingly beautiful. Her skin was pale, a faded light blue that seemed to glow faintly, and her long red hair cascaded over her shoulders. But her eyes, black and deep, held something that sent a jolt of recognition through Carl. She was different, vulnerable, yet fierce. The princess? This is Princess Lara, my daughter, the queen said, her tone softening ever so slightly, though still laced with authority. She is dying. Her Vara flame fades, and only you, a human, can restore it. Carl's mind raced. He was a soldier, trained to fight and protect. But this was something entirely beyond his understanding. He had heard of many things in his time on Earth, but alien queens and mystical flames? This was insane. And what exactly do you expect me to do? He asked, crossing his arms over his chest, his voice calm but laced with defiance. He wasn't one to easily bend to authority, alien or otherwise. The queen stood from her throne, her long gown brushing the floor as she descended the steps toward him. There was an intensity in her presence that made the air around Carl hum. She stopped only a foot away, towering over him despite his height. Her black eyes bore into his with a terrifying clarity. You will reignite her flame, the queen said, her voice low and dangerous. You will give her the energy she needs, and in doing so, you will save not only her life but our entire kingdom. Carl stared at her, his thoughts a storm of confusion. And if I refuse? The queen's lips curled into a dark smile, sending a chill through him. Refusal is not an option. You are bound by the prophecy. You will fulfill it. Before Carl could respond, the queen's hand shot out, gripping his chin with surprising strength. She leaned in, her breath hot against his ear. Ignite my daughter's flame, human, she whispered, her voice like a threat wrapped in velvet, or I will personally see to it that your existence becomes one of endless suffering. With that, she released him, turning her back to return to her throne. The Princess Lara had been silent all this time, but her eyes never left Carl. There was something there, a plea hidden beneath her fierce exterior. She didn't want this any more than he did, yet her life depended on him. Carl clenched his fists, his mind racing with questions. Why him? What was this flame? And what exactly would he have to do to save this princess and himself? The queen's voice cut through his thoughts once more, booming through the hall. Take him to the chamber, she ordered. The ritual must begin. Carl's mind raced as two armored guards approached him, their black eyes cold and mechanical as they flanked his sides. He considered resisting, but it was clear there was no way out of this. The guards grabbed his arms and began to lead him down a long, winding hallway. The crystalline walls glowed faintly, reflecting the same alien beauty as the throne room, but Carl couldn't admire the strange architecture. His mind was focused on Princess Lara and the unnerving ritual he was about to take part in. What did this Vara flame mean? How could he, a human, reignite it? His questions were countless, but no one had given him answers. As they reached the chamber, the door slid open silently. The room was dimly lit, the light coming from strange blue orbs hovering in the air, casting an ethereal glow. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar-like structure, its surface covered with ancient symbols pulsing with faint light. At the edge of the altar stood Princess Lara, her pale blue skin nearly translucent, her once vibrant red hair flowing like fire against her faded complexion. Her eyes met his for a moment, and though her gaze was cold and detached, there was a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or desperation. She didn't want to be here either. Whatever they were about to do, it wasn't something either of them understood fully, but the queen's wrath hung over them like a storm cloud. Carl was brought forward, his heart thudding in his chest as the guards positioned him in front of the altar. The queen stood in the shadows of the room, watching with a burning intensity. Her black eyes were unreadable, but filled with the weight of her command. This was no simple act. It was life or death for her daughter, and failure was not an option. Begin the ritual, the queen ordered sharply, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Lara's breath hitched slightly, and Carl could feel the tension radiating from her as she stepped closer to him. Their hands touched first, her skin cool against his. There was a moment of hesitation between them, an unspoken barrier of unfamiliarity, but the urgency of the situation drove them forward. Slowly, their fingers intertwined, and Carl felt a strange pulse in his chest, as though his body were reacting to her presence in some primal way. Her hands were delicate but firm, and as their fingers locked together, the glowing bonds tightened, connecting them more intimately. The light from the ancient symbols around the room began to intensify, filling the air with an electric hum. Lara closed her eyes, concentrating. He could feel her body trembling slightly as she moved closer, her forehead resting against his. Their breaths mingled in the small space between them, and he could feel the faint rhythm of her heartbeat, weak but persistent. Her energy was fading, and she needed him. Needed his strength to bring it back. But nothing happened. The heat between them should have sparked something, an ignition of energy, but the air around them remained still, heavy with expectation. Lara's hands gripped tighter, her body pressing against his, but there was no connection, no flame. Carl's breath quickened as her touch grew more desperate. Her skin, cool against his, seemed to shimmer as she tried to channel the energy needed to light her Vara flame, but her efforts were in vain. He felt nothing but the pressure of her body, and the strange sensation of being bound to her. A sudden sharp gasp escaped her lips, and her body slumped slightly, exhausted from the failed attempt. She was panting now, her forehead still resting against his, her hands trembling in his grip. The queen stepped forward, her eyes darkening with anger. "Why has it failed?" she demanded, her voice echoing harshly in the chamber. She moved toward them swiftly, her gown trailing behind her like shadows. The prophecy was clear. You were supposed to ignite her flame, human. Carl, still bound to Lara, met the queen's furious gaze, his own frustration mounting. "I don't even know what this is," he shot back. "You've thrown me into this without any explanation." The queen's nostrils flared, her face inches from his as she loomed over him. "Excuses will not save her," she hissed, her voice cold with fury. She turned her sharp gaze to Lara, whose body sagged against Carl's as if drained of strength. "You must focus, Lara. Your life depends on this." Lara's eyes fluttered open, her breath shallow as she struggled to stand upright, still bound to Carl. "I tried, Mother," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "but my body. It doesn't respond." The queen's expression darkened even further. "Then make it respond," she snapped. "Your flame must be reignited, or you will wither and die. Do not let weakness control you." With a final look of disdain, the queen turned and stormed from the room, leaving them alone in the dim light. The chamber was silent, except for the sound of their breathing, still heavy and labored from the attempt. Lara finally lifted her head, her eyes meeting his once more. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice strained. "I didn't want this." Carl, though still confused, could feel the weight of her burden. Her life was slipping away, and he was somehow meant to save her. "But how?" "Let's try again," he said, his voice calmed despite the situation. "But this time, let's not rush it." Lara nodded, her body still trembling. She leaned closer, her breath warm against his neck, her skin brushing his as they prepared for another attempt. The ritual wasn't just about survival. It was about something deeper, something more intimate, and they had to find it together. "Ready?" he asked softly, watching as Lara nodded, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. They pressed closer, this time their bodies aligning as much as the bonds would allow. Carl felt the coolness of her skin, and beneath it the faintest pulse of life. His heart began to pound in response, and he focused on that feeling, on the strange electric connection he could sense between them as their bodies moved together. Carl felt Lara's desperation, her need for the flame to spark. Their breaths mingled in the small space between them, and he could feel the tension growing as they moved with increasing intensity. Each movement was meant to draw out the energy they needed, but despite their efforts, nothing changed. Sweat began to bead on Carl's forehead, and Lara's body trembled from the strain. Minutes passed, and exhaustion settled into their limbs. Their bodies were slick with sweat, their muscles aching from the prolonged effort, and still, the flame refused to ignite. Lara collapsed against him, gasping for breath, her energy spent. Carl panted heavily, frustration gnawing at him. He could feel her fragility now more than ever, her body growing weaker with each failed attempt. He pulled against the restraints, wanting to comfort her, but the bonds kept them tied in place. "It's not working," Lara whispered, her voice filled with despair. "I'm trying, but my body doesn't respond." Carl clenched his jaw, the futility of the situation burning in his chest. The Queen's demand echoed in his mind. Failure was not an option, but what could they do differently? He leaned his forehead against hers, feeling the tremor of her breath on his skin. "There has to be something we're missing," he murmured after the exhausting second attempt. The Queen reappeared, her stern expression barely masking her frustration. She approached them with a cold air of judgment, her black eyes narrowing as she took in their weakened states. "Why has it failed again?" the Queen demanded, her voice laced with impatience. Lara, barely able to stand, looked up at her mother, her lips pale and trembling. "I don't know," she whispered. "We've tried everything." The Queen regarded them for a long moment, her sharp gaze flickering between Carl and Lara. Then, as if struck by a realization, she turned toward the far side of the room, where an ancient figure stood cloaked in shadow. A Luminar elder, his face lined with age and wisdom. The Queen's eyes flashed as she approached him. "What is the meaning of this?" she hissed. "The prophecy says the human is the key. Why has the ritual not succeeded?" The elder bowed slightly, his voice low and measured. "The prophecy speaks of the connection between the human and the princess, yes, but it is not an immediate bond. Their energies must learn to harmonize, to recognize one another. The Vara flame is more than physical. It is the merging of their spirits, their very beings. Only time will allow such a bond to form." The Queen's eyes flared with anger. "Time? She doesn't have time." "The process cannot be rushed," the elder explained calmly. "They must spend time together, experience one another beyond the ritual. Only then will their bodies and minds align." The Queen's fists clenched, her frustration clear. "Very well," she spat, her tone barely controlled. "They will spend the next few days together, but I will not tolerate another failure." She turned on her heel and stormed from the room, leaving Carl and Lara to absorb what they had just learned. The elder bowed once more before quietly slipping back into the shadows. Carl looked at Lara, her face pale and drained, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes now. "So we need time," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Time to connect." Lara gave a slight nod, her expression weary but resolute. "It seems that way. My body isn't ready yet." Maybe it never was. Carl felt a strange sense of relief, despite the dire situation. If time was what they needed, then they would take it. He just hoped it wouldn't be too late. That evening, Carl and Lara were led to a private chamber, A room more modest than the grand halls of the palace, but still elegant by human standards. The walls were adorned with soft, glowing crystals, and a large window offered a breathtaking view of the planet's luminous sky. Dinner was brought to them, a strange assortment of fruits and glowing liquids, unfamiliar but surprisingly pleasant. They ate in silence at first, both exhausted from the day's efforts, but as the quiet stretched between them, Carl began to feel the tension ease. "I'm sorry," Lara said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. Carl looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For all of this," she continued, her black eyes meeting his. "You were taken from your world, from your life, and now you're stuck here, forced into this." Carl considered her words, then shook his head. "I've been through a lot, Lara, more than I ever expected. But this is different. I don't understand it, but I'm not going to let you die." Lara's lips curved into a faint smile, the first hint of warmth he had seen from her. "Thank you," she whispered. They finished their meal, and the exhaustion from the day began to weigh heavily on them. Without speaking, they moved toward the large bed in the center of the room, its plush surface inviting after the strain of the ritual. Carl hesitated for a moment, unsure of the boundaries in this new situation, but Lara slid into the bed first, her body sinking into the soft fabric. She looked up at him with a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "We're supposed to be together," she said softly, her cheeks flushing faintly, "to let our bodies recognize each other." Carl nodded, understanding the deeper implications of what the elder had said. They had to form a bond, not just physical, but something more intimate, something real. He lay beside her, their bodies close but not yet touching, the space between them charged with a strange magnetic tension. As the night wore on, they talked quietly, their words slowly drawing them closer. Lara told him about her planet, about her people and the responsibility she carried as the princess. Carl, in turn, shared stories of his life on Earth, his military service, his search for purpose after leaving the army. Their voices grew softer, and the room seemed to shrink around them, pulling them into a quiet intimacy neither had expected. As the night deepened, Carl found himself turning toward Lara, drawn to her in ways he hadn't anticipated. She lay facing him, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of vulnerability and strength. Her pale blue skin, once vibrant, was still dimmed by the fading Vara flame, and her exhaustion was evident in the way her body relaxed against the soft bedding. Yet there was something else, something stirring beneath the surface. Lara's breath was steady, though her gaze held a question she hadn't yet asked aloud. When their eyes met, the tension between them shifted, turning into something more intimate. Without words, they moved closer, the unspoken bond pulling them together. Their breaths mingled, their lips hovering just inches apart before finally meeting in a slow, tentative kiss. The touch was gentle at first, testing the boundaries of the connection that had begun to form, but soon the kiss deepened, filled with the warmth and intensity of the moment. Carl felt the coolness of Lara's skin against his, the softness of her lips, and the way her body responded to his. It wasn't just about the ritual anymore. There was a need between them, a desire that transcended the pressure of their mission. Their hands explored one another, carefully tracing the lines of unfamiliar bodies. Lara's touch was hesitant but curious, as though she were learning something new with every moment. Carl, too, moved with deliberate slowness, respecting the vulnerability of the situation. It wasn't rushed, but rather a quiet, growing intimacy that built between them as they shared the space. The room remained quiet, save for the soft sounds of their movements. The connection between them deepened as they continued, their bodies pressing closer, skin against skin. Their touches became more purposeful, the heat between them rising. It wasn't about urgency. It was about the natural rhythm they found together, a slow but inevitable dance of connection. As they moved together, the tension from the day slowly melted away, replaced by a deeper sense of understanding. They weren't just fulfilling the demands of the ritual. They were building something of their own, a bond forged in the quiet moment between them. Hours passed in a haze of warmth and quiet passion. They explored each other fully, losing themselves in the heat of the moment, the exhaustion of the day, the weight of the ritual. All of it seemed distant now, as they shared this moment of vulnerability and closeness. Finally, as the night stretched on, and their energy waned, they rested against each other, their breathing slowly returning to normal. Lara's body relaxed against Carl's, her head resting on his chest, and for the first time in days, there was a sense of peace between them. Carl wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer as they drifted into sleep. Morning came too soon. the soft glow of luminous sun filtering into the chamber. Carl stirred awake, feeling the warmth of Lara's body still nestled against him. For a brief moment he allowed himself to savor the quiet, the softness of her presence, before reality came crashing back, the ritual, the flame. Before he could fully gather his thoughts, the door to the chamber swung open with a loud, commanding creak. The queen stood in the doorway, her expression as stern as ever, her black eyes sharp and unyielding. "Rise," she ordered, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "It is time to attempt the ritual again." Carl sat up, his body still heavy with sleep, but the weight of her words jolted him awake. Lara stirred beside him, blinking against the light as she sat up as well, her expression serious. There was no time for hesitation now. The queen's demand was clear, and this time they had to succeed. "Prepare yourselves," the queen said, her tone harsh but purposeful. "The ritual must work." Carl exchanged a look with Lara, their shared understanding deepening. They had spent the night forging a bond, something that went beyond the physical, and now they would face the ritual with renewed determination. As they rose from the bed, the quiet intensity between them remained, the connection from the night before lingering in the air. They both knew what was at stake, but now there was a sense of calm between them, an unspoken confidence that they had begun to understand each other in ways that went far beyond the prophecy. Together, they stepped into the chamber, ready to try once more. The chamber was bathed in a dim ethereal light, as Carl and Lara stood at the altar once more. The weight of their previous failures pressed heavily on both of them, but the night spent together had changed something. There was a new unspoken understanding between them. The queen stood in the shadows, her eyes sharp, observing every move. There would be no more delay. The ritual had to succeed this time. Carl felt the familiar pull of the glowing restraints as the guards fastened their hands and feet together once again. The soft electric hum of the energy coursing through the room was almost palpable. He glanced at Lara. Her skin was still pale but with a faint hint of color, as though the Vara flame was stirring deep within her, waiting to be reignited. Their bodies pressed close, their skin cool against one another. The air was thick with anticipation as they began the ritual, moving together in slow, deliberate harmony. Lara's breath was soft against his neck, her body responding to his with a quiet intensity that hadn't been there before. Carl could feel the heat building between them, slow at first but steadily rising. Their movements were fluid, synchronized, as though they had done this 100 times. The energy between them hummed in the air, growing warmer with each passing second. Lara's grip on his hands tightened, and Carl could sense the effort it took for her to focus. Her life depended on this, on him. As they continued, their breathing became more labored, the heat between their bodies intensifying. Sweat began to bead on Carl's forehead, and he could feel the same slickness on Lara's skin as they moved together in a rhythm that felt almost primal. Her body was trembling slightly, but not from weakness. There was a strength growing within her, a fire slowly beginning to awaken. The symbols on the altar began to glow brighter, their light pulsing in time with their movements. Carl's heart pounded in his chest, the energy surging between them, pushing them forward. Lara's color began to darken. The pale blue of her skin deepened as her body responded to the flame they were trying to ignite. Her breaths came faster, and Carl could feel her muscles tightening beneath her skin as she moved in sync with him, her body pressed closer. The heat between them built to a near unbearable level. Their sweat mingled as they continued their movements, more intense, more deliberate, as though they were both feeding into the growing energy that was beginning to take hold. Lara let out a soft gasp, her body arching slightly as the Vara flame stirred within her. Her skin, once dim and pale, was now glowing with a faint blue shimmer, the dark color slowly returning as her body came to life. Carl could feel the change, the warmth radiating from her, the connection between them strengthening. He moved with her, feeling the flame flickering between them, growing brighter with each passing moment. Lara's hands gripped his more tightly, her body moving up and down in a fluid, rhythmic motion that matched the pulse of energy in the room. The symbols on the altar glowed brighter, casting long shadows as the ritual reached its peak. Sweat dripped from Carl's forehead, his breath ragged as the heat between them reached its zenith. He could feel the flame now, burning between them, pulling them closer with every movement. Lara's body trembled with the effort, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as her skin darkened further, glowing with the vitality of the flame being reignited within her. Suddenly, the air around them seemed to crackle with energy. Lara's eyes fluttered open, locking with Carl's. Her body shuddered as the flames surged to life, the glowing symbols on the altar flashing brilliantly before dimming into a soft pulsing light. Lara's skin, now a rich vibrant blue, shimmered with life as the Vara flame fully ignited within her. Her breath slowed, deep and steady, as her body glowed with warmth and power. The ritual had worked. Carl exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling heavily as he held her close, their bodies still intertwined from the intensity of the ritual. The tension in the room dissipated as the Queen stepped forward, her expression unreadable but clearly satisfied. "It is done," the Queen said quietly, her voice cutting through the stillness. Lara leaned against Carl, her body humming with the energy of the flame now burning inside her. She looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with gratitude and relief. For a moment, they simply stood there, their breaths in sync, the success of the ritual washing over them. But the peace didn't last. Without warning, the Queen's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "Guards," she snapped, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Take him away from my daughter." Carl blinked, momentarily stunned. His mind raced to catch up with what she had said. The guards, standing at attention near the chamber's entrance, moved toward him swiftly. He tensed, his military instincts flaring, but there was no immediate threat, just an overwhelming sense of confusion. The Queen's eyes locked onto Carl's, her expression cold, almost indifferent. "You have fulfilled your purpose, human. We are done with you. You can go back to your world." Carl's throat tightened as her words hit him. The connection he had just forged with Lara, the bond that had saved her life, seemed to unravel in an instant. He turned to the princess, but she looked just as stunned as he felt. "Mother, no!" Lara's voice trembled as she stepped forward, her hands reaching toward Carl as though to stop the guards. "What are you doing? How can you treat him like this? He made me— well, he saved my life." The Queen's face remained stoic, her eyes narrowing as she addressed her daughter. "You heard me, Lara," she said coldly. "The prophecy has been fulfilled. His role is over. We will not go further with a human." Lara's lips parted, her breath catching as if the weight of her mother's words had knocked the wind from her. "But you can't just send him away," she protested, her voice rising with a mixture of disbelief and desperation. "He did more than just fulfill some prophecy." Her words faltered, unable to fully express the depth of the connection that had formed between them. "Enough!" the Queen snapped, her tone final, cutting through Lara's words like a blade. "We do not mix with humans. He served his purpose, and now he will return. There is no place for him here." Tears welled in Lara's eyes as she shook her head in disbelief. "How can you be so cruel?" she whispered, her voice breaking as the tears began to spill down her cheeks. "How can you just discard him like this after everything he's done for us, for me?" Carl stood frozen, his mind swirling in a haze of shock. His chest felt tight, his breath shallow as he tried to process the Queen's sudden cold rejection. He hadn't expected gratitude, but he hadn't imagined it would end like this, cast aside as though the bond he and Lara had shared meant nothing. The guards moved closer, their expressions unreadable as they prepared to escort him away. Carl wanted to say something, to protest, but his throat felt dry. The words caught somewhere between disbelief and the painful realization that there was nothing he could do. Lara, still crying, stepped toward her mother, her voice shaking. "Mother, please don't do this. He deserves better than this." The Queen's gaze remained fixed, her resolve unshaken. "You are a princess, Lara. You must think of the kingdom, not your emotions. He will go back. This is the way it must be." Lara's shoulders slumped as the weight of her mother's decision pressed down on her. She turned to Carl, her tear-filled eyes searching his face for something that would change the outcome. But Carl could only stand there, speechless, unsure of how to respond. He had faced countless challenges as a soldier, but this felt different. This felt like a loss he hadn't anticipated. The guards stepped forward, their hands firm but not aggressive as they moved to take Carl by the arm. Lara's tears continued to fall as she reached out toward him, her voice barely a whisper now. "Carl, I'm so sorry." He could barely muster a response, his throat tight with emotion. He wanted to tell her it was okay, that he understood. But did he? How could he? Everything had changed so quickly. The bond they had shared was now severed by the cold decree. His mind was numb, unable to fully comprehend what was happening as they moved him out of the chamber. The last thing he saw was Lara, her body trembling with sobs. standing helplessly as her mother's cold presence loomed over her. Carl moved numbly as the guards led him through the grand halls of the palace, his mind still reeling from the Queen's harsh dismissal. His connection with Lara, forged through moments of intimacy and survival, was being ripped away just as it had begun to deepen. He could still feel the warmth of her skin, the weight of her presence, lingering on his senses, even as he walked further away from her. Suddenly, a commotion broke the stillness behind him. The sound of hurried footsteps and panicked voices echoed through the hall. Carl stopped, turning just in time to see the guards who had been standing near the Queen running toward the throne room. Then he heard the Queen's voice, sharper, more desperate than he had ever heard it before. "Bring him back now!" The guards at Carl's side exchanged a glance before releasing him, urgency replacing their cold formality. Without hesitation, Carl turned and ran back toward the throne room, his heart pounding in his chest. As he entered the chamber, his blood turned to ice. Lara lay on the ground, her skin fading rapidly back to that pale, deathly hue he had seen when her Vara flame had nearly gone out. Her once vibrant blue skin was now ashen, her breath shallow and weak. The Queen stood over her daughter, her cold demeanor shattered, panic flashing in her dark eyes. "She's fading again," the Queen muttered, her voice thick with disbelief. "I don't understand the flame." Carl didn't need to hear any more. He rushed to Lara's side, his instincts taking over. Without hesitation, he knelt down, pulling her fragile body into his arms, cradling her head gently on his knees. Her skin felt cold, lifeless, and the sight of her in such a weakened state sent a surge of fear through him. "Lara," he whispered, brushing the hair from her face. Her lips were parted, but no breath came. Her body lay still, her energy drained once more. The Queen, desperate now, spoke sharply. "It's you she needs. You only can bring her back." Carl barely registered her words. He bent down and pressed his lips gently to Lara's, praying that the connection they had shared could somehow revive her. For a moment, nothing happened. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly. But then a faint spark stirred beneath her skin, a warmth spreading from her lips to his. Lara's body shuddered, and her pale skin began to regain its color, slowly darkening to the rich blue hue that signaled her life returning. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and luminous as they met Carl's. She blinked in confusion at first, then recognition dawned in her gaze. Her lips parted, and a soft breath escaped her, the life that had almost slipped away now returning. "Carl," she whispered, her voice fragile but alive. He smiled, relief washing over him. "I'm here," he murmured, his hands still resting gently on her cheek. "I'm not going anywhere." Lara's body relaxed in his arms, the flame reignited stronger this time. The Queen, though silent, seemed to finally understand the truth. It wasn't just the ritual that had saved her daughter. It was the bond she shared with Carl, the connection that had transcended the prophecy and become something far more powerful. Carl held Lara close, her breathing steady once more. He didn't know what the future held for them, but in that moment, as she lay safely in his arms, he knew one thing: he wouldn't leave her side.